So part of our discussion this semester is going to include a look at what in the United States and much of Europe is sort of the paradigm by which we have looked at history over the last 100 to 150 years. That paradigm we call Eurocentrism. A definition of Eurocentrism, which I've taken from the Urban Dictionary, but you can find something similar in Webster's or the Oxford English Dictionary or whatever. Eurocentrism is the practice of viewing the world from a European perspective and with an implied belief, either consciously or subconsciously, in the preeminence of European culture. And there's an example here as well. In a sense, Eurocentrism looks at the world with European values at the center of that viewpoint and tries to understand the world through European values. Eurocentrism shows up in our everyday life as a myth in many cases, where we assume that the values that are held by Western culture, beginning with the Greeks and running all the way through the contemporary world, are a set of mythological or myth-level ideas that explain the world. And we treat these ideas as if they are so important that they can't be questioned. But not everyone thinks of Eurocentrism as a myth. Many people use Eurocentrism as an ideology. That is, according to historian Robert B. Marks, Eurocentrism can be thought of as a distortion of the truth that allows the West to mask its global dominance. In other words, the West uses Eurocentrism to explain Western global dominance as if it were ipso facto true, and therefore excuses any activity that the West uses to dominate the rest of the world. But what we're concerned with in this class is Eurocentrism as a theoretical model. That is, Eurocentrism and Eurocentric ideas as one way among many for explaining how the world works. So theory is based on this idea of the scientific method, which we look at here next to that V. We start with a theory, as you know if you've taken any science courses. And that theory comes from observations of the world. We form a hypothesis and then we observe or experiment, and that experiment either confirms or disproves our theory. Or we can go the opposite direction. We start with an observation, we discern a pattern, we create a tentative hypothesis which we test in experiment, and if that experiment seems to suggest that our hypothesis is correct, we then call that a theory. A theory being a relatively solid set of ideas that seems to suggest a pattern in nature of the way that things work. So theories are used to predict the truth, and then we design an experiment to test that prediction. We perform the experiment and observe its results, and then we create or modify the theory based on the results of those experiments. And Eurocentrism has been one of history's central ways of observing the world. And we're going to decide in this class if all of the observations, hypotheses, and experiments have been successful, or whether we can look at the world from a different point of view. And there is value in that experimentally and theoretically. One of the things that we do have to think about is that Eurocentrism is more than just viewing history from a European point of view. It is not just one of many ethnocentric views of the world, of which there are many. Certainly, Chinese history looks at the world from a Sinocentric point of view. There are many centrisms. But Eurocentrism, like other centrisms, certainly emphasizes the ideas that all is good in the world comes only from Europe. But it also sees that package as having universal application. In other words, not only do Eurocentric thinkers believe that the world is built on these European ideas, but they believe that eventually European ideas will come to dominate the entire world, and that in fact they do, and everyone else is therefore only working in the realm of myth. Eurocentrism also sees Europe as the only active shaper of world history. According to this view, Europe has agency. It does things. It moves history. and the rest of the world is passive and stagnant. China, for example, or Australia, or Latin America has no history except insofar as European or European outliers such as the United States have acted upon it. Critiques of Eurocentrism certainly abound in the world and certainly among historians. And this is primarily because, as I said earlier, Eurocentrism in history is treated as an intellectual theory, one by which we can try and explain the way that the modern world works. But that also means that it is important for us to test that theory through experiment and research. And historians' job is to do just that. Critics of Eurocentrism say that Eurocentrism is not just a belief in European superiority. It is a paradigm that provides a framework for the truth according to its believers. Such a paradigm needs to be tested because if it remains untested, then any mythological elements that might work their way into that paradigm may end up being treated as truth when they actually don't describe the world according to experimental ways at all. So it's important to test Eurocentrism. One of the key issues in Eurocentrism, and this is neither good nor bad, so keep that in mind, but Eurocentric thinkers certainly see the United States as the pinnacle of Western civilization, its greatest, Eurocentrism's greatest expression. And if that is the case, then it follows that it's important to test the theory of Eurocentrism in order to understand why that is so. It also follows that it's important to test Eurocentrism in order to understand whether that is so. So what assumptions are we starting with? Well, most of us have never questioned the paradigm from which we look at history. So we assume that Eurocentric ideas are true without really examining them. That's intellectually dangerous because, as I said, untrue ideas can creep in over time, and if they remain untested, then we find ourselves believing in falsehoods. Just finding more facts, though, won't do in order to test or dispel Eurocentric beliefs. And that's because this is a paradigm, and as a paradigm works, so does Eurocentrism. All the facts inside the paradigm tend to confirm the paradigm. So we have to find different facts from new experiences and find out whether those facts also can fit within the Eurocentric paradigm or whether they require us to look at the world from a different angle in order to understand them. So the question that we're asking right now then is, can there be a non-Eurocentric explanation for a world with European features? And the answer to that is probably yes. We can begin and end our story of history in a different time and place. Rather than starting, for example, in 1500 or 1492, in this class we'll start a bit earlier, and we won't start with Europe. And we can include parts of the world that are not included in the Rise of the West narrative. We'll look at China, we'll look at Africa, we'll look at Japan, but we'll also look at the West. And we'll see if all of the histories of those areas fit within the European or the Eurocentric paradigm. We'll also see that a global storyline not centered on the West can explain the rise of the modern world, even though the modern world tends to have Western or European characteristics.